The great illusion of money and the greatest collapses in history. Every empire swears that its money is safe. Every government claims that its promises and its system will last forever. And history, every single time, without exception, proves them wrong. From Rome to France. From the American Civil War to modern Lebanon, millions of people throughout history woke up one morning and saw this. The money they had worked for and saved throughout their lives had become nothing more than a piece of paper. Their salaries had become meaningless, and those massive systems they thought were solid had stolen their entire future overnight. My friend, the painful truth is this. Collapse is not a rare accident in the financial world. Collapse is the main rule of the system. The real question we need to ask today is not, will financial systems collapse? It is, when those systems collapse, how will you protect yourself? Do you know what our greatest financial mistake is? The illusion of permanence. At night we open our phones and look at the numbers in our bank accounts. We look at the national currencies in our pockets and assume they are as solid as rock, that they can never fall because huge states stand behind them. But money is not a rock. Money is only a collective belief. The system stands because all of us choose to believe that those colorful papers or the pixels on a screen have value, and that belief can disappear overnight, just like the wind changing direction. That is why history is so cruel, but also so useful, because human psychology and the reflexes of those in power have not changed for 1,000 years. In this video we will talk about the secret formulas of those who survived the greatest collapses in history, the points at which systems crack, and how to protect not your money, but yourself against the approaching global storms. If you are ready, let us lift the curtain on humanity's greatest illusion. Byzantium and the suicide of money in the mint. For our first great lesson in history, we rewind time and go to the Byzantine Empire. While Western Rome collapsed and was buried in history because of barbarian invasions, internal turmoil, and economic decay, Eastern Rome, that is Byzantium, somehow managed to survive for another 1,000 years. So, do you know what the secret power behind this incredible survival ability was? Its armies? Its walls? No. The answer was the gold coin called the Solidus, beating at the heart of the economy. The Solidus was such a pure, stable, and reliable gold coin that every merchant from Europe to the Middle East and from there to the farthest depths of Asia accepted it without question. Whatever the American dollar is for global trade today, the Solidus was exactly that in the medieval world of its time. It was the world's first true global reserve currency. But power always brings arrogance and blindness with it. You would expect the Byzantine emperors to have learned from the famous economic trap that brought down the great Rome before them, right? You know, that story of Roman emperors secretly reducing the amount of silver inside the silver denarius coin to finance wars, eventually turning it into an almost worthless copper coin. At that time, Rome destroyed its own credibility by debasing its money and accelerated its collapse. But no, human beings do not learn. Centuries later, Byzantine rulers also became trapped. Wars dragged on, borders shrank, and it became harder to finance the dazzling luxury of the palace. Where did they find the solution? Paper money and the printing press had not yet been invented, but the dimly lit mints of the palace were there. The emperors slowly began shaving down the purity of the gold solidus. They reduced the gold content of the coin and mixed in copper, bronze, and cheap alloys. They minted the coin thinner and made it lighter. At first no one understood anything. After all, the imperial emblem on the coin was the same, and its color still shone. But the market is not stupid, my friend. In the financial world, there is a rule. Bad money drives out good money. The moment people realized that the amount of gold inside the coin was decreasing, they began hiding their old, pure gold coins under the mattress and giving the state those new, fraudulent coins. Once trust cracks, the rest unravels like a loose thread. The debasement of the Solidus completely destroyed the stability of the famous Byzantine economy that controlled Mediterranean trade. When money became unreliable, foreign merchants stopped selling goods. Inflation exploded. So, who remained wealthy at that time? Those who trusted the fraudulent promises and official decrees printed by the state? Of course not. The clever merchants who secretly collected old, pure gold beyond the reach of the empire's tax collectors and mint, or those who held productive, fertile lands, preserved their wealth. Everyone else watched their money evaporate. Here is history's first timeless lesson. When governments are cornered, they can never resist the temptation to debase money, in other words, to print money without backing. And when they do this, real value always flees to tangible assets that the system cannot imitate or multiply at will. Tulip Mania, the masses who fell in love with illusion. So, are financial collapses only the fault of incompetent governments or greedy kings? No. Sometimes the thing that causes the system to collapse is directly the public itself, meaning humanity's endless greed. To become rich, a greed that disables logic. Now let us go to Amsterdam in the Netherlands in the 1630s. The greatest maritime trading empire of the period, a center where money flowed like water, and the first great financial bubble recorded in history, Tulip Mania. Yes, you heard that right. A tulip, the flower you know growing in the fields. At that time, this flower, brought to Europe from the Ottoman Empire, suddenly became a wild status symbol among the Dutch aristocracy. Especially rare tulip bulbs with variegated marbled colors caused by a virus became so popular that prices exceeded all limits of reason. Things reached such an unbelievable point that in trading guilds, for the price of a single rare tulip bulb, one could buy 3-story mansions along Amsterdam's most luxurious canals, tons of wheat, shiploads of timber, or dozens of cattle. People were buying tulips to plant them and watch them in their gardens. Everyone was chasing the same dream. These prices will rise even more. If I buy this bulb today for 100 gold, next week I will sell it to another madman for 200 gold and become rich. Bakers, shoemakers, nobles, carpenters. People from every layer of society began mortgaging their homes, fields, and shops to buy tulip contracts. The tulip had not yet bloomed. It was still underground. But on paper, everyone was a millionaire. Everyone looked at each other and told stories of wealth. Until that famous February morning. In 1637, at a routine tulip auction in the city of Haarlem, buyers refused for the first time to pay those outrageous prices. A silence fell over the room. A few people began whispering, "What are we doing? This is just a flower. It will bloom in spring and wither a few weeks later. Why are we giving our entire fortune for this?" That small fragment of logic and doubt turned within hours into a massive wave of panic that swept across the entire country. Everyone rushed to the market to sell their tulip contracts, but they could not find a single buyer in front of them. Trust was reset to zero overnight. The next day, those famous tulip bulbs that could have bought a mansion the day before could not even be sold for the price of an ordinary onion at a market stall. Thousands of families lost all their savings in one day and were left completely ruined. And the Dutch economy entered a deep depression. The lesson here applies today to everything from cryptocurrency markets to stock market speculation. If the price of an asset has completely broken away from its real-world utility and productive power, and if it depends only on the belief that some greater fool after me will buy this at a higher price, then it is an illusion. And in the financial world, illusions never last forever. Sooner or later, they burst. The Black Death and the ruthless redistribution of wealth. Sometimes the thing that shakes the financial system and the established order is neither governments printing money nor people's wild speculation. It is nature itself. In the mid-1340s, Europe faced the darkest and most terrifying nightmare in its history, the Black Death, the plague pandemic. In only 4 short years, because of this disease carried by trading ships coming from Asia, almost half of Europe's entire population died. Cities turned into ghost towns. Trade routes were completely severed, and fields were left ownerless. People thought the end of the world had come. It was a full apocalyptic scenario. But behind this terrible human tragedy lay a very strange economic mechanism and a massive transfer of wealth, one that economic historians still study with astonishment today. Think about it. What happens when half of the labor force, meaning half of the population, suddenly disappears from a system? The balance of supply and demand is shaken from its roots. Labor, meaning living human beings who can work, becomes incredibly valuable. Peasants and workers who managed to survive the plague looked around and saw that the lords and feudal masters were desperate. If the fields were not harvested, the lords would starve. The peasants turned to their masters and said, "I will no longer work for those old starvation wages. You will pay me twice as much. You will remove the feudal pressures on me. Or I will go to the field next door." The power of workers and labor rose more sharply than ever before in history. On the other hand, vast lands, mansions, and houses that had once belonged to lords and were considered to be worth a fortune were now empty. Because there were no people left to work those properties or live in them, there was an abundance of property. At that moment, small families who had a little silver, cash, or tangible durable goods before the crisis entered the scene. They bought those huge lands and mansions at bargain prices, almost for nothing. Some peasant families that had lived like slaves for centuries suddenly became the new landowners of their regions. Social classes were overturned. Now, while listening to this story, pause for a moment and think. Does this situation sound uncomfortably familiar to you? It should, because we, as humanity, experienced a much more modern and sophisticated version of this exact thing during the COVID pandemic in 2020. Lockdowns came, supply chains broke, and production came close to a halt. So what did modern governments do? So that the system would not stop and the wheels would keep turning, they pressed the button on the printing presses and injected trillions of dollars, euros, yen, and lira into the markets. What happened as a result? Ordinary people living paycheck to paycheck with no reserves or assets on the side were crushed under the massive wave of inflation created by all that printed money. They lost their purchasing power and became even poorer. But what did that small minority with liquidity, cash power, and reserves do? When stock markets crashed in the first days of the pandemic, they bought the shares of the best companies at the bottom. While people sold property in panic, they bought houses and land at low prices, and when the pandemic ended, they doubled or tripled their wealth. The rhyme of history in this section is very clear. Great crises, wars, and pandemics always redistribute wealth. And this ruthless redistribution rewards those who have cash reserves and preparation on the side, while punishing the indebted, those tied to the system at the core, and the unprepared very heavily. The banks of Florence and the lie of too big to fail. Now we come to the greatest, most organized, and most dangerous lie in the financial world, a lie that has not changed from that day to this one. This institution is too big to fail. To understand the roots of this lie, let us travel to the heart of the Renaissance, to Florence in the 1340s. The global financial center of that period, the New York, or London of its time, was Florence. There were massive, deeply rooted banking dynasties such as the Bardi and the Peruzzi, who shaped the city and all European trade. These men were so powerful and so wealthy that they gave enormous loans to the kings, popes, and dukes of Europe to finance wars and build palaces. Ordinary Florentine citizens, shopkeepers, and workers thought this. Nothing can happen to these banks. Behind these men stands the mighty King of England. Behind them are great armies and dukes. My money is in the safest place in the world. And they took the gold and silver they had saved throughout their lives and deposited them in the vaults of these banks. But there was one thing they forgot in the banking world. The greater the risk, the harder the collapse. King Edward III of England, during the famous 100 Years' War with France, announced that he could not repay the huge loans he had taken from the Bardi and Peruzzi banks. The king officially defaulted, meaning, in today's language, he said, "I am bankrupt. I am not paying my debt. Come and get it if you can." Do you know what happened when the king did not pay his debt? The Florentine banks that the whole world at the time called unbreakable, too big to fail, began collapsing one by one like dominoes. The vaults were opened, and it was seen that they were empty. When the banks collapsed, nothing physically terrible happened to the King of England or the Florentine elites. They continued living in their palaces. But the life savings of ordinary citizens, orphans, and workers who trusted the size and grandeur of those banks evaporated overnight. Trade in the city stopped, wages could not be paid, and the great city of Florence was dragged into massive economic chaos and darkness that would last for many years. Now let us come a little closer to recent history. Did we not watch the same movie in 2008 when the American financial giant Lehman Brothers collapsed? While funds and banks worth billions of dollars collapsed overnight, the retirement funds of people who trusted those institutions disappeared. And as recently as yesterday in historical terms, in 2023, we all watched live broadcasts showing how the doors of those huge regional banks in America, such as Silicon Valley Bank, were locked overnight when depositors panicked. My friend, engrave these words in your mind. Too big to fail is one of the oldest lullabies. Financial capitalism tells you to put you to sleep and seize your money. Institutions, banks, or funds do not exist to guarantee your survival or protect you. They exist only and only to make a profit for their shareholders. And when those institutions collapse, they take your savings with them without shedding a single tear. In the financial system, true survival belongs to the alert people who realize early that the promises of an institution or a state remain valid only until the day they are forced to do the opposite. The German nightmare and the revenge of paper money. So how can a currency, those pieces of paper for which lives are spent, turn at the extreme point into a tragicomic joke? To see the answer, we go to one of the greatest and most dramatic financial nightmares in economic history, Weimar Germany in 1923. Germany, which emerged from the First World War with a major defeat, had to pay war reparations of an unimaginable size to the victorious states under the Treaty of Versailles. Moreover, because of the war, factories had been destroyed, production had stopped, and the country's most productive mines had been seized. In other words, there were no goods in the country, no production, but there was a massive debt to be paid. Do you know what the German government did? It resorted to that primitive and easy method used by every cornered government in history. They pressed the button on the printing press. Day and night, accelerating the gears, billions and trillions of marks began to be released into the market. At first, everything seemed fine. There was plenty of money in the market. But since there were no goods to buy, all that printed money suddenly poisoned the economy. The result was that great period of madness that entered economic history as hyperinflation. Things reached such an unbelievable, surreal point that people going to the bakery in the morning to buy a loaf of bread did not put money in their pockets. They had to fill wheelbarrows, sacks, and crates at home with cash. Money was no longer counted, it was weighed. Think about it. You went to a restaurant. The price at the moment you looked at the menu and ordered the meal was not the same as the bill that came to the table after you had finished eating. Because money was losing value within hours, even minutes. People drank their coffee quickly because while the coffee cooled on the table, its price increased. The value of money had fallen so much that in winter people did not go to the market to buy wood or coal to light the stove or fireplace at home, because throwing the paper money itself into the stove and burning it was much cheaper than buying firewood with that money. Money was worth less than fuel. Children played in the streets by stacking bundles of million-mark banknotes into towers because money had become cheaper than paper toys. There were families who covered the walls of their homes with money because buying wallpaper was expensive. We saw the same dramatic collapse during the American Civil War when the money printed by the South, the Greybacks, collapsed. We saw it when the patriotic assignats of the French Revolution, supposedly printed with backing, were printed again and again until they eventually became worth less than toilet paper. Let us not go too far. We saw it in recent history in Venezuela, where after the local currency, the bolivar, lost all value, people wove handbags and wallets from paper money and tried to sell them to tourists for a few dollars. Do you know who survived these terrible collapses and who preserved their wealth? Not the so-called millionaires on paper who held millions or billions of paper marks in their wallets or bank accounts. They turned into beggars in one day. The real survivors were those who had factories, those who had fields, those who physically held wheat and flour in their warehouses, or those who stepped outside the system and stored foreign currencies and physical gold in safe places. The lesson of history here hits like a slap. Blindly trusting those pieces of paper in your wallet or bank account or those digital numbers will never provide you with protection. Real protection means holding real tangible value that the system and the printing presses cannot destroy through inflation and cannot multiply. The German nightmare and the revenge of paper money. So how can a currency, those pieces of paper for which lives are spent, turn at the extreme point into a tragicomic joke? To see the answer, we go to one of the greatest and most dramatic financial nightmares in economic history, Weimar Germany in 1923. Germany, which emerged from the First World War with a major defeat, had to pay war reparations of an unimaginable size to the victorious states under the Treaty of Versailles. Moreover, because of the war, factories had been destroyed, production had stopped, and the country's most productive mines had been seized. In other words, there were no goods in the country, no production, but there was a massive debt to be paid. Do you know what the German government did? It resorted to that primitive and easy method used by every cornered government in history. They pressed the button on the printing press. Day and night, accelerating the gears, billions and trillions of marks began to be released into the market. At first, everything seemed fine. There was plenty of money in the market. But since there were no goods to buy, all that printed money suddenly poisoned the economy. The result was that great period of madness that entered economic history as hyperinflation. Things reached such an unbelievable, surreal point that people going to the bakery in the morning to buy a loaf of bread did not put money in their pockets. They had to fill wheelbarrows, sacks, and crates at home with cash. Money was no longer counted. It was weighed. Think about it. You went to a restaurant. The price at the moment you looked at the menu and ordered the meal was not the same as the bill that came to the table after you had finished eating. Because money was losing value within hours, even minutes. People drank their coffee quickly because while the coffee cooled on the table, its price increased. The value of money had fallen so much that in winter people did not go to the market to buy wood or coal to light the stove or fireplace at home, Because throwing the paper money itself into the stove and burning it was much cheaper than buying firewood with that money. Money was worth less than fuel. Children played in the streets by stacking bundles of million-mark banknotes into towers, because money had become cheaper than paper toys. There were families who covered the walls of their homes with money because buying wallpaper was expensive. We saw the same dramatic collapse during the American Civil War, when the money printed by the South, the graybacks, collapsed. We saw it when the patriotic assignats of the French Revolution, supposedly printed with backing, were printed again and again until they eventually became worth less than toilet paper. Let us not go too far. We saw it in recent history in Venezuela, where, after the local currency, the bolivar, lost all value, people wove handbags and wallets from paper money and tried to sell them to tourists for a few dollars. Do you know who survived these terrible collapses and who preserved their wealth? Not the so-called millionaires on paper who held millions or billions of paper marks in their wallets or bank accounts. They turned into beggars in one day. The real survivors were those who had factories, those who had fields, those who physically held wheat and flour in their warehouses, or those who stepped outside the system and stored foreign currencies and physical gold in safe places. The lesson of history here hits like a slap. Blindly trusting those pieces of paper in your wallet or bank account, or those digital numbers, will never provide you with protection. Real protection means holding real, tangible value that the system and the printing presses cannot destroy through inflation and cannot multiply. A crisis is a transfer. Which side will you choose? As you can see, my friends, centuries change, the names of empires change, technologies change. Money is first minted in gold, then printed on paper, and today it turns into digital numbers on bank screens. But the collapse pattern of financial systems and the human psychology behind it never change. History proves a very clear truth to us. Every great crisis is not actually a financial disappearance, but a massive transfer of wealth. Money does not suddenly vanish. It only changes hands. A massive stream of wealth flows from the unprepared majority, who blindly trust the system and think everything will keep working smoothly forever, toward the small minority who sense the fragility of the situation early, doubt it, and prepare. In a crisis, while the rich become richer, the middle class is completely erased. So, how will you protect yourself against the approaching global debt crises and waves of inflation? Never forget the 3 golden rules filtered through the dusty pages of history and whispered into our ears. First, you will not blindly trust any system. No currency, no bank, no global institution is indestructible. Leave the comfort zone of nothing will happen to us and realize the fragility of systems before the doors close in your face. Do not be afraid to be the first to doubt. Second, you will own tangible assets. When illusions, lies, and paper money collapse, when the storm calms, only real things remain. Things central banks cannot print at will and cannot imitate. Land, physical gold, means of production, and real goods. Always diversify your portfolio with real values outside the system. Third, and most importantly, your greatest capital is your own skill. Even if all currencies reset to zero tomorrow morning and banks close completely, humanity will always continue to need the baker's bread, the carpenter's hammer, the programmer's code, the doctor's medical knowledge, and the tailor's needle. Those in power can reduce the value of the money in your pocket to zero with a decree, but they can never reduce to zero the ability inside your mind to produce something and create value. The greatest and most impenetrable financial shield in the world is your own productive power. Never stop investing in yourself. We have reached the end of the video, my friend. Now take a deep breath and ask yourself this vital question. When everything one day breaks apart again, when the financial system makes that famous cracking sound, will you be among the naive majority left with only broken promises, devalued papers, and locked banking apps? Or will you be among the prepared minority who foresaw the storm and held real values and tangible assets in their hands? The decision and the responsibility are entirely yours. If this video interrupted your financial sleep and gave you a new perspective, do not forget to press the subscribe button below, like the video, and share this vital warning with your loved ones and friends. History always has an answer in its pocket, as long as we know where to look and how to apply those lessons to our lives. See you in the next video, in another hidden room of history. Take care of yourself and stay safe.